Okay, greetings from Costa Rica and hello everyone. Welcome to our masterclass and thank you for being here. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to see some friends and familiar faces here. Welcome to our masterclass on regenerative development and the redesign of the human impact on Earth with Daniel Wahl. I'm very happy, Daniel, to welcome you here. Thank you. I'm particularly happy with this opportunity for me to get to know more of Daniel and his work, but as an opportunity to reflect and learn on this important topic. And I really look forward to our exchange and interactions today with all of you. Again, warm greetings from a beautiful blue sky day in Costa Rica. You just probably heard the students from the University for Peace making noises here. So we are located on the University for Peace campus for actually many years. And today's session is part of our Education Center Masterclass program that is organized under the umbrella of our UNESCO Chair on Education for Sustainable Development with Earth Charter. And this UNESCO Chair has the purpose to develop research and education opportunities focused on that intersection between sustainability, values and ethics, and education. And this UNESCO Chair was founded 10 years ago, actually. I am Miriam Vilela. I'm the Executive Director of the Earth Charter and coordinator of the Earth Charter International and coordinator of this UNESCO Chair that is located here and jointly with our Education Center and the University for Peace. Let me again warmly welcome all of you and invite you, if you want, to introduce yourself in writing in the chat box, your name and location, and maybe indicating where you are in your work if you feel like. In this way, it's just a way for us to identify who is joining us and start making connections. So our masterclass normally lasts for about an hour, 40 minutes to 2 hours. And the first part of it involves a presentation by our main guest speaker with some interaction with me. And then we open the floor for a quick Q&A. And then we go and split the group so that you have a chance to exchange views, talk, share your insights with other participants. But what brings us together here today is really the question around what is regenerative design and how can we make that happen in practice? Daniel Wahl is here, and I'm really honored and happy to welcome you here as part of this masterclass program, and I'm grateful that you accepted to do that. And he's here to help us address that question and dig a little bit more on this topic. So Daniel is the author of the Designing Regenerative Cultures book, and is a whole system design and regenerative development specialist. He's originally from Germany, but has lived for many years in the UK and now in Mallorca. I'm happy to hear or to learn that he's a teacher of Schumacher College. And I was just telling him that Schumacher College has been an inspiration for me for, I think, 20 years. He's also consultant and educator in regenerative development, whole system design, and transformative innovation. And I was actually also very interested to know that he was the director of the Findhorn College between 2007 and 2010. So Daniel holds a degree in biology, in holistical science, and he has a doctoral thesis on design and design for human and planetary health. So, and I understand you're joining us today from Mallorca. Thank you, Daniel, for being here. So tell us a little bit about your journey and how you entered into this path of regenerative design. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for this warm welcome. And before I start, I just want to say that for me, this is really special because I've had this conversation with Miriam before, but to share this with others. Over 20 years ago, in 2001, I together with a friend in the south of Spain, in the Alpujarras, started an initiative where we, back then it wasn't emails, but actually postcards. We printed 2,000 postcards and sent them to people of influence across Europe, because we wanted to have a restart to the millennium, like having just lived through the change from 1999 to 2000. And all that happened was a big party and some scare about the Y2K bug. We wanted to have a deeper conversation as humanity about where are we going in the next millennium. And the purpose of this postcard campaign was to get world leaders to endorse the Earth Charter as a binding document within the United Nations at the beginning of the millennium. And so for me, this is really special to have this conversation, but we're not there yet. But I think now actually that would be more relevant than ever, because we are falling into patterns that we thought we left behind in the last century. And we're starting to create very strong blocks of interest and bellicose language again on the planet. And I think before we go down that spiral of destruction, having that conversation of we need to find, because of climate change and because of resource depletion and because of it not being 5 minutes past 12, but 25 past 1, and us having long passed the point where we know that a livable future for humanity is still possible in 150 years, we need to find higher ground. And I think the Earth Charter is the best shot we've got to at least start somewhere that has already gone through a lot of, like, it's been contributed to by people from all around the world. It was a world leader that recently died, so that might even help in this particular conversation to actually say, let's look at this document again and say, before we, as things get tough on planet Earth because of climate change that we have caused, or to be more fairly, that a small percentage of humanity have caused, and all of humanity, particularly those who haven't caused it, have to suffer from, because the global north caused climate change and the global south is living the consequences daily already. And well, actually, we're now doing that everywhere. To come back to the point of the Earth Charter, I think it's precisely that what you also said in the introduction, why the University for Peace exists. How do we bring sustainability, ethics, and values together? I think that's probably the most important question we've got as a species. If we do not pass this rite of passage, if we do not mature to that point as a species, unfortunately, I don't want to sound too negative, but I don't think we have a very long future ahead of us. And we're a very immature and young species. And the beauty would be to go through this rite of passage and see what we could co-create on this planet, if we were to remember that we've only come here because our ancestors have been regenerative cultures, carefully working as custodians of the places that they saw themselves to be living expressions of. And that is the worldview that still exists in indigenous people all around the world. And it's not an outdated worldview of saying we need to go back to the golden past. No, it's actually the relevant path into the future. It's reconnecting with our species inheritance, that we actually know in our genes how to be keystone species in an environment. Our role is to disrupt the environment, but not to the point of destroying it, but to the point of making it more abundant, to garden it. And if we come back to the places we inhabit, and we ask ourselves collectively at a scale where people have a face and we share a cultural story and a common watershed or a common ecosystem, at that kind of scale of regional development, we could say, how would we redesign our presence on Earth to be regenerative in this place, to make this place thrive, the soil more abundant with life, increase the forest cover, heal the rivers, heal the sea that is bordering this place, if that's the case. And at the same time meet human needs in a new way, which might mean slowing down, because maybe part of the unsustainability of the current system is the speed at which it's running. I'm certainly feeling I'm running in that in my personal life, that there's something really unsustainable with the rhythm that we seem to all be asked run on that. But yeah, that was a very long opening to say I really love the Earth Charter, and I wish we would actually, famously Napoleon said before the Battle of Waterloo to his servant, "Dress me slowly, I'm in a hurry." And while that's questionable to have servants and fight battles at Waterloo, but that statement of precisely because of the urgency, and precisely because we're running so quickly into the old patterns of othering, whether it's between Russia and America, or Russia and Europe, or NATO, or China, evil, it's just, honestly, it feels like sitting in the playground in front of a sandbox and say, kids, grow up. We've got much more important things to do to go into those kind of behavior patterns anymore. And if we don't do it, we don't have a future. How about we leave it there and you ask me a question?
Yeah. Thanks. So regenerative design, you talked already a little bit about some ideas behind it, but can you help us clarify why regenerative design, and what do you mean by that?
Well, it's interesting because I have a background in design. I did my PhD in design, and I've taught at different design schools. And because of that, I know that most of the design-focused culture thinks about how to create answers to problems or answers to the complex issues we face, very often in the mindset of the designer as the creative problem solver. And I probably was party to that in my own way of thinking for a number of years. But the interesting thing about regenerative design is that it's almost a paradox, because design is human intention expressed through interactions and relationship. It's to understand the system and kind of drive it in a certain way. But regenerative is to really, really sense into the natural rhythms of life. What wants to happen in this place? What wants to happen in this culture? What is the story of place that has brought us here? And what is the potential in each and every one of us in this unique locality on planet Earth to manifest something that would allow all of life, humans and non-human, to express their maximum potential? And that's basically saying, how do we heal the planet to its maximum point of dynamic health, to its maximum capacity to meet an uncertain future with creativity? Because we've always, as human beings, lived on a planet where we didn't know whether we had another day. Like, a meteor could come any day. There's a number of scenarios that could end this story. So there is uncertainty in everything. And complexity science in the last 100 years has very clearly showed us that all complex dynamic systems are fundamentally unpredictable and uncontrollable unless you put them into a time frame box and a spatial box. So if we abstract them out of the real world, then we can predict them and control them. But within the context of the real world, we can't. And all of us and the ecosystems and the biosphere, they're all very big, nested, complex systems. So how do we live with this fact that we have to act, but we don't know how? We don't know the outcome of our actions. And how do we come back to this humility to understand that all our technology and all our science, as blingy and as wonderful it might be, we don't really know how to use it wisely. We will always be surprised by hidden side effects of its use. And so maybe we should use it a lot less and a lot slower and a lot more carefully in order to be able to respond to the impact, because we've used it for 150 years with, well, if we can do it, let's do it and let's scale it out. And that didn't really get us very far. It created all sorts of nice technologies that have saved some lives and done wonderful things, but it also created a lot of problems. So the regenerative question is not necessarily about what normally designers think about, which is the deliverable. What is the design? What is the thing that I can show to the world and say, look, I'm Philip Stark, I designed this. But the new way of thinking regeneratively is to say, how do I create designs in the implementation of which I learn something, my team, my staff learns something, my client learns something, the community that the design is taking shape in learns something. And what is that something? The capacity to continue evolving what that something is, to not leave it there and let it, okay, delivered. We've built a bridge. We've asked to build a bridge. Here it is. No, you have to build the bridge in such a way that the community understand why the bridge is there, how to take care of the bridge, and to question whether it needs to be there in 50 years' time when things have changed. And that's a very different way of working. It's so regenerative design in foregrounds the process and the capacity building, and design normally foregrounds the product. And what I'm trying, that's why I use the gerund, designing regenerative cultures, because designing is a process. Design, when we use that word, too often mentally makes us think about objects. And that's where then the dissonance comes with regenerative, because it's really regenerative designing or living regeneratively that my book is about, and not designing in the conventional sense. Does that clarify this a bit? Yeah.
Yeah. So there are many concepts that are similar, right? We have been hearing for many years sustainable development, sustainability, now regenerative development, regenerative design, system thinking, or system design. So I have some ideas. Actually, a month ago, both of us, we were together in a webinar precisely talking about that. I would like to hear more from you on how do you distinguish the idea, the concept between regenerative development and design with sustainability, or even with system design? Is it similar, complementary, is completely different? What is the difference?
Well, before I go, like I'll share a slide that kind of talks about that. But just before I go there, there's a sort of slight discrepancy of how different people in the regenerative development or movement, it's normally called the regenerative development movement more than regenerative design, but the designers are waking up to it and giving meaning to the regenerative design dimension of it. But Cara Sanford, Pamela Mang, Ben Haggart, Regenesis Group, there's a number of people involved in this. They run capacity building all over the world. They run a program called the Regenerative Practitioner Training, and they're wonderful people and really hold a deep practice that is structured around how to focus on the process, how to focus on capacity building, how to focus on the essence of people and the potential of place, rather than how to immediately jump into problem solving and solutioneering like the normal sustainability approaches. So that's one distinction, and they live that very with a lot of experience and practice over a long time. But they also, in my personal judgment, creating too clear of a line to, we're not biomimicry, we're not sustainability, we're not systems thinking, we're not this, we're not that. In my interpretation, there are people in the Biomimicry Institute that I know think regeneratively when they work on a project. There are people in the sustainability field all over the world who have put capacity building into the foreground and have worked on this in a way that it has come out of the story and the place. And so I think the judgment of, well, that's not regenerative is a little bit, how are you to tell at this point? We're all learning. And so that said, this is a graph that I actually developed from an earlier version by my friend Bill Reed, who is part of Regenesis. Like all these people I learn from, and I deeply appreciate them, but I also need to name my perspective. So briefly, can you see this one? Yeah. I'm just going to pull it over here so I actually look at you. So actually, no, this way I can't see it. Hold on a sec. Like that. You can see it fine like that, or do I need to fully?
We can see it, but if you can share full screen, it might be better. Yes, perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Sorry that I won't look at you, but you look at the slide anyway. So very briefly, this shows on the one hand, that we're talking about a spectrum. So we're talking about the journey. That I like. So it means that whether you making the journey from conventional to green, even if it's just to then over-communicate it in greenwash, you're beginning to have a conversation around reducing your impact. Whether it's with the right motives is another question. Then the step from green just doing a little less damage to not having any impact in this scheme, which comes from Bill Reed, is zero impact. So Bill McDonough from Cradle to Cradle, he wrote the book together with Michael Braungart, used to say sustainable is 100% less bad. Meaning it's the point where it doesn't have any negative impact, but it doesn't necessarily heal the damage that has already been done. But as we move from sustainable to restorative, we're trying to do that. But that's where a lot of people get confused. That's where people think regenerative ends. So they think do good is the regenerative paradigm. And you could, I have another version of this slide where under these five, they're what Carol Sanford describes as the four modern paradigms that are currently operative at the same time. One of them is maximize profit and benefit. That's not caring about the destruction and is just looking in a very narrow way at counting everything through financial benefit to a small number of people that are involved with that benefit. Then the next step will be to arrest disorder, which is to slow down the breakdown of the system that is caused by that first way of acting. And the next one is do good. So rather than just slowing down this order, which is unfortunately what seems like the COP26 and 27 conversation, the climate change conversations are still all too much about just slowing down the disorder instead of really deep healing. And regenerative is a step further. It's not that solutioneering that proposes in these kind of cowboys, Bill Gates and so on, or Elon Musk styles, massive scale-up solution, gigafactories, more electric cars, but is actually saying, no, this is all not looking at the systemic interconnections of it. We need to slow down and bring how we fit into place back to the locality and the local culture. And because we know that we don't know whether our solutions will be the final solutions. I mean, this is one of the things that is central in my book, that my book has 250 questions, because when I started writing it, I realized that giving people solutions would make the book out of date really quickly, because history shows us that yesterday's solutions become tomorrow's problems. But giving people questions asks them to ask that question in their context, in their time, whether they read my book now or in 50 years. And some of those questions might actually have a different meaning, but still value to somebody in 50 years' time. And it's that kind of epistemological aikido, you could say, of getting people into a different way of knowing, where what they're actually working on is their capacity to keep evolving with the system they're part of, rather than fight with each other about solutions. That is at the heart of this shift between the solutioneering approach to sustainability and the regenerative approach to building a sustainable and a regenerative presence on Earth. Just briefly, a couple of things about this graphic, and then I'll stop sharing, is you can see that, again, like there's a lot of critique on the SDGs. I was involved through Gaia Education in formulating the SDGs. I developed a very detailed teaching tool called the SDG flashcards for Gaia Education. And even when I was doing that, I was also somewhat critical of some of the SDGs and how they've been implemented. And for me, one of the, just in parentheses here briefly, one of the things that I regret is that it feels like from the beginning we've wasted 80% of the energy in reporting and 20% of the energy in implementing, and we should have actually stopped reporting for the first 10, 15 years and just got on with it and then started reporting, because I feel so much energy got into, like I saw people who are brilliant teachers, normally are in the field building capacity, spending weeks and months in offices on long reports. I think that was a predatory delay, maybe, if you want to be negative about it. Anyway, briefly, you might see that I've put a little change in the icon of SDG 8. I put a spanner there, because I think that's the spanner in the works. If we don't have a conversation about this inbuilt growth imperative that currently drives the unsustainability of our economic system, and therefore the death knell of civilization, we will never implement the SDGs. So one of the biggest problems with the SDGs is that right in the middle sits a Trojan horse that we need to talk about. Anyway, the last thing about the slide is this shift in worldview, because that's also, if you work sustainably, you might still be in the modern scientific progress paradigm of saying we value what we quantify. At the beginning of the scientific revolution, Galileo divided the world into different types of what he called qualities and said, we're only interested in the measurable ones, which is basically quantities. And then we build a science on quantitative analysis, but we haven't paid enough attention to the qualities of interrelationships of all the fields that we're studying with that science. And similarly, we're using metaphors. Watch yourself. We're constantly using metaphors like clockwork, like computer, like the brain works like a computer, and this works like a robot. And that's a mechanistic, technology-driven worldview. If we try to invite our thinking into organismic, like Fritjof Capra-inspired systems view of life, kind of dynamic understanding of interrelationships, we would use very different metaphors. We would think in circles and in flows and without fixed objects, but everything dissolves at some point into something else. It becomes a dance. It becomes something that in its very nature invites us into thinking long term, because the technical system is very short term and tends to be hijacked by the economic system, which at most thinks in 4-year cycles. So as you can see, the shift is goes much deeper than just changing. Oops, stop sharing, and now I can't see you at all. Can you still see me? No?
We can see you, just
okay,
not
and
the,
stop sharing.
the
Okay,
sharing.
great. So yeah, I think on the one hand, it's not just a change of adjective. That's the biggest problem we have at the moment that is actually happening on the planet, is that all the consultants that were in their description, or even the NGOs, everybody is jumping on board. The governments, wherever they had the word sustainable, they're going in, they're changing a few words, and then they put the word regenerative. But that's not going to change anything. And that's the danger when an idea like this starts growing too fast. And our responsibility, everybody that jumps deeper into this rise of the regeneration, is to remind people that there is a deeper worldview and value systems shift that comes along with this, and that is actually a fundamental remembering. That for me is also really important, and I've only come to that in the last year and a half, as I looked more deeply into the, like I was concerned that with this tendency to create another other that we see in the world, with the social media driven othering and canceling culture on so many different levels, the polarizations we see around political parties in so many countries around the world, the polarizations we see between blocks. Another big polarization that I keep seeing is in the attempt of finally starting the conversation that is so necessary about the healing of the trauma caused by colonialization and the kind of actions that were inflicted on indigenous people all around the world. We run the danger of using the white man's weapon, which is to classify these people as other, by calling them indigenous. They never called themselves indigenous. We are all indigenous to life. There is no human being who is not indigenous to life. So we're all indigenous. How do we create that higher ground that values what these first people's cultures that were custodians of their places, that actually still deep in their own storytelling remember how to be regenerative in place. How do we value those, bring them into the 21st century, give thanks to our elder brothers, like in the Kogi in Colombia, for having been custodians of this way of seeing the world, and move forward together, rather than create another other, which is, you've had your 500 years, now it's our turn, and create this false separation between indigenous and non-indigenous. So for me, that is vitally important. And because of that, I think we need to go one step further of also not just recognizing that we're all indigenous to life, every human being. Basically, you could say that Europeans that were the cause of colonialism had part of their own, the Romans, colonialized large parts of Europe just 2,500 years earlier, traumatize a bunch of people, burn what we call indigenous wisdom at the stake in the form of women through the Dark Ages. And then the trauma caused by that made those people go out and do the same, inflict the same trauma on others. And I don't think we will come out of that cycle if we don't recognize that there is indigenous wisdom all over. Like if you talk to the Sami people of Scandinavia, they hold the same kind of wisdom as the Kogis in Colombia or people in Africa. It's reconnecting with that human and life's inheritance of our capacity to be regenerative and to anchor us not just in our indigeneity to life, but also in the fact that life itself, the regenerative impulse of life, can flow through us. Because when we do that, one important thing changes that might, at this point in the game, change everything. People stop believing that we build an utopia that is called diverse regenerative cultures everywhere that are healing the planet. If they think it is something that we now have to invent from the start. But the minute people return to the here, the now, the deep knowledge of their own bodies, the knowledge that nature teaches you, the minute you start asking. I've taken on half a hectare and planted 210 trees in a small forest garden over the last year and a half. And the apprenticeship and the deep courtship and relationship with this piece of land and the deep transfer of insight that is nonverbal, that can happen and that can teach you something if you just open up to it, is not theory for me anymore. It's practice. I've been living it for the last year and a half, and I've seen it with so many other people. Like the story of Findhorn, you mentioned Findhorn. These were people that had no idea about permaculture or anything. And then Dorothy McLean sat there and meditated on what to do. And pretty much everything that was given to her in meditation, today you look at it and say, yeah, basically they followed basic permaculture principles, but they never read Bill Mollison's book. It wasn't written by then yet or anything. They simply, in their language, they attuned to the spirits of nature and listened. And nature told them what to do, and they grew famous vegetables and managed to like basically build a whole story around their gardening that in a sand pit in the north of Scotland that surprised many people around the world and made them go there. I'm mentioning that because it's an example of what happens when we let that in, that we are actually capable of healing life as life. And that's why it's important to come back to regenerative cultures in that deep way of saying, no, this guy isn't talking about the next thing that, oh yeah, another utopia. We called it ecotopia at some point, and now we call it regenerative cultures. No, this is a coming back to life. And that requires humility and it requires audacity. That's the paradox we're facing.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I like the way you put it, because it helps us to, or invites us to think that it's not a fight between the concept of sustainability versus the concept of regeneration. I think it's important for us to be on that wavelength it's not a either or, but at least the way I see is that many people perceive sustainability or sustainable development as a concept that invites us to shrink or to diminish our negative impact on Earth, and to do less to generate a negative impact. Whereas regenerative development is more an invitation for us to increase our positive impact on Earth, and to think more of not only shrinking the negative impact, but increasing the positive impact that we generate with everything we do on Earth. However, some could argue, including me, that the notion of strong sustainability has always been that. It's kind of regenerative development is sort of equal to strong sustainability, in the sense that it has always been a more, I would say, advanced level of sustainability in looking at, okay, it's not just about figuring out ways in which we can generate less negative impact on Earth, but more, okay, we have to leave a better impact, or think more of a positive impact we leave on Earth. What do you think about that distinction?
Well, again, while I say, yes, there are a few people, or a small percentage, I would say, of people who worked in the sustainability field in a very regenerative way. This, like the just as much as there are designers that aren't focused on objects, but more on process. But the normal, like, we have to really watch out how powerful the word is. Like it says in the Bible, in the beginning there was the word. There's a reason for that. Like, or Goethe's Faust, it all spins around that, because words are powerful. And if we, like, even when I started doing my PhD, I thought I was going to write my PhD on design for sustainability. That was the initial working title. And 3 years into it, I just discovered that that's not what I was writing about. That it didn't actually, that the word was empty. It didn't say what we're trying to sustain. Humanity, okay, well, the Brundtland definition. Oh, so we can meet the needs of current generations without jeopardizing the needs of future generations. How anthropocentric. All of that. And also all in a mindset so deeply rooted in the 1980s, technology will ride over the hill and save us, we can do it. And it's still there. It's still in the COP conversation. If I invite everybody who wants to say, like, oh yeah, but the green future, techno super future, strong sustainability is possible. Watch this 12-minute TED talk by my friend Olivia Lazard on the blind spot of the green energy transition, I think it's called. It came out earlier this year. She's works as an analyst at the Carnegie Europe Center on regenerative foreign policy. And they've really looked at the detail of this and shown how, basically, in order to make this green, blingy energy transition to all renewables, all electric cars, it's very questionable the current oomph we would be doing it for all humanity. We just continue to build the inequality and only do it for some of us. But even if you leave that apart, which you can't, it still is the very fact that in order to do this, we would need to mine more, build more factories, do more in order to change. And the resources that we need are precisely located in the biodiversity hotspots of the planet. So unless we have the maturity, and this is where the Earth Charter comes back in, to honor our interconnection with life to the depth that we say, in these areas, yes, we know there's a lot of this stuff, but this is not for us. We will never take this. Because out of this area comes the last bit of biodiversity that might keep the planet alive in the long term, after we've already reduced it to only a few areas. And right now, I don't see us taking that maturity. So if we keep having the conversation as is the normal, strong sustainability conversation, which is, here's a problem, climate change. Here's a problem, inequality. Here's a problem, like there's a list of problems, I just showed them to you. reconvert the 17 SDGs into the great problems of the world, and they become the solutions of the world. It's a problem-focused approach. And what we do, what our education system, what science has taught us to do, is to say, here's a problem. Let's really understand this problem. So you bring brainy academic people who have not so much contact with the world anymore because they've been overeducated into a room together to talk. And I'm one of them. To talk about the problem, make it even more abstract. And then you do this a few times, and eventually you bring in the designers and the technologists, and you do a hackathon, a design sprint, or whatever you want to call it, for 3 or 4 days to come up with solutions to these big problems. And some foundation funds it. And then beautiful solutions come out. And then some angel investor comes along and says, how do we scale it up? That's great. Let's bring it to the world. And then they bring the money and the solution into small communities, and they say, look, we're really nice, we're doing good here, have this. But they never ask the solution, the community, whether does this fit, what do you need, what does this place want? And it's that is the difference towards regeneration. And I don't think that is in strong sustainability. So just as my perspective, but I'd love to hear your reflection on
it helps me at least to expand and clarify this. So coming back to regenerative development and regenerative design, can you share with us what are the indicators that could show us that we are on the right track towards regenerative development in design? What could be the indicators?
I mean, I'm on really thin ground here anyway, because we, as I said, you can't predict and control complex dynamic systems. I've also said climate change is probably already in runaway in many ways, which has led brilliant scientists like one of my mentors, James Lovelock, who recently died, to come to the conclusion that it is highly likely, if not almost certain, that the end of the 21st century, there will be about 500 million people on the planet. But if we sit with that scientific cold piece of data, we ignore the death and suffering of at least 7.5 billion people, but probably more, because we'll go up to about 10 million by the middle of the century, and then it would collapse in 50 years to a 20th of the global population. And that's what people who, like James Lovelock, just to give you context, that this is not some kind of truth-saying bad prophet. He's not just the co-founder of the Gaia hypothesis together with Lynn Margulis that turned into Gaia theory and has basically driven Earth system science that allows us to do the work that the IPCC now does, understand global climate dynamics. He was also the first person who, as a private scientist, bought himself a ticket on the Shackleton to travel all the way down to Antarctica and do the measurements to then find out that chlorofluorocarbons were responsible for the hole in the atmosphere. He's the scientist who in 1960 built a small little piece of equipment, which is called the electron capture detector, that enabled to measure minute quantities of any kind of new chemical in the atmosphere. And it's that data that allowed, a few years later, Rachel Carson to write Silent Spring and kicked off the entire environmental conversation at the 1972 conference in Stockholm. And the whole conversation, one man. And this man, in his last years, he died at 103, was extremely negative. I don't agree with him on many things. I don't agree with him on his attitude towards nuclear energy and synthetic food and a number of things. But he's not to be taken lightly. And the only answer I have to this is, like, the guy knows more about the Earth system than I do, and he's he's definitely more brilliant than me, that's for sure. But if we hold that complex dynamic systems are unpredictable and uncontrollable, then we have to go deep into accepting that we do not know. And that means that even that kind of prediction we cannot say for certain. And I am willing to work on the basis that I plant an apple tree today, even if the scientists tell me the world will end tomorrow. But it's that kind of change that we need to somehow bring into humanity, and it evokes a much deeper a connection to these indigenous wisdoms, that it actually is not so important whether humanity makes it. Because humanity is an expression of a larger process called life. And if humanity matures to the point of understanding that its contribution to that larger process of not killing it, but making it more abundant, making it more thriving, is more significant than its own continuation, then another paradox happens. It's precisely in letting go and saying our role is to further life in the best we can, humbly, not through engineering the next generation of silicon-based life forms out of carbon-based life forms like crazy people in the Singularity University and all of that are proposing to intelligent people at MIT. All of this is going on this planet. But if we can pull back and say, no, the real answer, and this is where I think that we need this deeper conversation instead of strong sustainability about diverse, local, regenerative cultures and not problem solving. Like yes, it is true. And there's nothing wrong with the framing to say, like the designers do, we are facing a wicked problem. That's been around for 30, 40 years. And wicked problems are basically nested complex systems that are unpredictable and uncontrollable. You try to address one or two of the problems, and before you know it, you have 5 new problems. Mm-hmm. But that's one way of looking at it. And what we've been trying to reduce the complexity by abstracting further and further into this problem solving and then solutioneering mindset. And what the true proposition, to my understanding, of this regenerative approaches is to flip the whole thing back around and say, what would happen if we actually stopped trying to solve climate change and we stopped all these global problems and we came together as a global, collaborative, connected, global human civilization in support of people everywhere to manifest the potential of places and people in every place through the process of healing the planet at, people like to say, wartime speed, terrible metaphor, but we have about 20 years left, if we're lucky, to pull off a miracle. And if we do, we can live in a new way that is at the same an ancient way of reconnecting to place as expressions of place. And again, so I'm not saying, like I say all this with a lot of certainty, and it's just my opinion. It's my opinion after 25 years of studying this. I don't have a crystal ball, and I must admit that my positivity of us taking this window of opportunity is shrinking by the day. Like when I wrote my book in 2016, I was a lot more positive that this window of opportunity gave us 10, 15 years to do this, but this is 8 years ago. And at the same time, I understand it's back to the dress me slowly, I'm in a hurry. The time is ticking ever faster, and so we're ever more likely to make ever more stupid mistakes when we don't have time to run off in the wrong direction. And this is the tricky bit right now. But it's another logical reason for why coming home to place and locality and a regional, to answer your question much more directly and much more concretely, what do I see? From my limited perspective, I see a radical re-regionalization of production and consumption everywhere, where people focus now on the capacity building of people in places around the planet to provide food, water, and energy sovereignty to the local population or the regional population, to look at where does our water come from, where does our energy come from, and to not try to match current consumption, but match what is really necessary to give people a meaningful life, even if there's a complete contraction of global economic activity and climate change driving it further. And it's literally building not just the infrastructure, the redundancy of lots of diverse renewable energy, community-owned renewable energy structures, of public transport rather than private transport that is in this transition electric or driven by hydrogen, depending on where people are and whether it makes sense. We have lots of fancy technological solutions, but we need to very wisely, almost homeopathically, use them in the right places. And that's a massive conversation that I don't see anybody willing to have.
Takes time. It takes time also in deep thinking. Examples are always helpful for us to really visualize that things can happen in a different way. So can you share with us a couple of concrete examples of regenerative communities or regenerative projects or even businesses that help us to visualize how does that look like?
So here's a proposition. I will give you an example, and it connects with what I said at the beginning. But it comes with the proposition of maybe this is an entry point for Earth Charter International to have a conversation with the Commonwealth Secretariat in London, which brings together at this very historical point with regard to the British royal system and all that. And yeah, let's not dive into the entire colonialism issue there. But if we hold, just as we can hold the United Nations, we hold the Commonwealth as the best system we've got to have a global conversation. But it's a slightly smaller subsystem. It's 54 nations, more than half of the global population, spanning all the continents and spanning all faith groups. They started in 2016, just after my book came out, a process that first was called Regenerative Development to Reverse Climate Change. Then there was political pressure to take out the word reverse climate change. But out of this process was created an initiative which is called Common.Earth. And anybody can, like if you put Common.Earth, you can see lots of examples of regenerative projects that this initiative has already started with around the world. But in terms of a concrete suggestion, I could imagine that a number of times in history, the 54 nations of the Commonwealth meeting at the Commonwealth meeting and agreeing on something, then going into UN full assembly in September with a clear agreement among 54 of them, actually created important decisions. So basically it was to some extent the agreement of the Commonwealth nations to act on climate change that influenced the famous Paris 2014 Accord, which wasn't enough and still isn't being implemented. But in this game, maybe we could bring the Earth Charter back into the conversation through the Commonwealth Secretariat. Put that aside, give a concrete example. The current Secretary General of the Commonwealth Secretariat, who's only there for another few years, is called Lady Patricia Scotland, and she originally comes from Dominique in the Caribbean. And the Quilongoa people, who are the people who live in this area, are very used to living on an island with a lot of hurricanes. And they were hit, I can't remember which one it was, the name of the hurricane, but they were hit really hard by a hurricane. And one of the projects that came out of this initiative is a island-based resilience center that works with the original people of that place to basically create exactly that, the capacity for them to help themselves after more hurricanes, rather than only the kind of, oh yeah, we will helicopter in aid. The combining ancient with modern technologies of the sacred with modern technologies. It's simple things like traditional Quilongoa gardens always had at least 1/3 or maybe even more of root vegetables. So should a storm rip off everything from the ground, you can dig out something to eat. And that's what made them survive after that. And that's one of many projects in New Zealand. There is a very, very high density of people that have been trained in the regenerative practitioner. And the beauty there was that as they were training, a large percentage of the participants in these courses were Maori First Nations people, or actually arrivals from 1,000 years earlier, from other Polynesian islands. They recognized in this circular, and this is the interesting, back to your question earlier, how does it relate to systems thinking? As a beautiful, like I talked to a Maori elder, one of the people who were in this delegation, Johnny Freeland. If you put Johnny Freeland, Daniel Wahl, YouTube, you'll find it. It's a conversation that is centered around from square to circular systems thinking. And in many ways, it dances around the difference between seeing systems as something out there that we manipulate and understanding that we are dynamic, embodied participants in the system, and that cause and effect are circular. But it does it and this is what happened in New Zealand when the regenerative practitioner was taught there, is that the original Maori indigenous worldview of appropriate participation in complexity, they didn't call it that, but that's what they were doing, fitted very well the worldview that regenesis was and the practices. So they found their own way of giving a locally unique expression of working regeneratively, and they've started work like Ecuador has of bringing back the rights of nature, of working with a river, of really working with the story of place through the river, and building a culturally appropriate bioregional change initiative. And if you go into the Capital Institute has funded a website which is called Regenerative Communities Network. And that Regenerative Communities Network is, to my mind, actually a misnomer. It should really be called Regenerative Bioregional Regeneration Initiatives, or Bioregional Regeneration Initiatives, because it's hardly ever a community of people living in a small place saying, we're going to build this little regenerative eco-village here. But it's all of the members there are much more interested in how do we use our agency in this system, our bioregion, to make this bioregion more regenerative in the long term, in full acknowledgement, like the last book that Carol Sanford wrote with Ben Haggett is called Indirect Work. And that's actually another way of saying working regeneratively. It's sort of akin, what's the famous saying of, if you want to teach people how to build boats, don't start by teaching them carpentry. Start by making them yearn for the sea. It's a very big difference. And that's what regenerative work is about.
That sounds nice. Love that metaphor. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to start bringing two questions that I saw in the chat box, and then my own last one. So I'm going to, if you allow me, I'm going to bring three questions at once, and you just...
Okay, great. That's better. Otherwise, forever.
Yeah. So from my side, it was something about values and principles. What are the values and principles underlying the notion of regenerative development, and how that links with the Earth Charter, or how can the Earth Charter can serve as an ethical foundation, as an instrument to this great work of regenerative development. So the question really is about values and principles underlying the notion of regenerative development, and what are the synergies between that and the Earth Charter. So that's my question. And then I bring a question from our participants. Carly Irwin said, you mentioned about regenerative lifestyles. What does that look like? So it's about regenerative lifestyles. What does it look like? And then Laísa Freire from Brazil, the University of Rio de Janeiro, asked something long, so I'm going to read that. Non-hegemonic sustainability positioning, mainly development within the global south, presents sustainability alternatives that do not perpetuate unlimited growth in a finite planet. Do you believe that some examples of degrowth emergencies linked to ancestries, valuing, for instance, Africanity, and recognizing alternative economies, ecological, feminist, or social and solidarity, have theoretical or even practical connections with regenerative systems, and how to overcome capitalist matrix system? That's a long one, but I hope you got the
yeah. I mean,
gist.
I could let me start there, and then you can remind me of the other ones, because there was so much in there that I think I still have the other ones. Yes, absolutely. In terms of all of these critiques of the degenerative patterning that has by now been so culturally insidious that I don't think anybody can fully detangle whether the memes and the thinking ways they're using are not somewhat influenced by what is ultimately a colonial Western worldview that was forced onto large part of the world. But it's so rife now that it's quite difficult for anybody to be outside of that system. So I think a lot of these critiques, and for me, it's just, like you were saying this earlier, and I almost said this earlier, like as you've noticed, instead of saying this is regenerative and all sustainability is bad, I at least always say there are people working within sustainability that working in a regenerative way. Like I personally run the practice that if I try to put things into polar opposites, it's either that or it's that. I ask what's the both and, or I think of it as a pendulum swing. We've done it this way for so long and seen so many wrong things come out of that we then overswing the pendulum to the other side and do the opposite. So it's like this conversation, for example, of we're going from the me to the we. In my learning about we, of being in community and working with intentional communities around the world in the Global Eco-Village Network and working with education for 10 years, a friend of mine once said to me, the best people in community are the ones that don't need the community. That's maybe overstating it, but it is actually saying something. It means that you have the responsibility to have a healthy me, of healthily providing for yourself and your family in order to also be a meaningful, capable, in the long term, member of your community to serve the community. The important bit is that you can only fully manifest your own potential in service to a larger whole, your community and the world. It's that nested, like it's the paradox that yes, we need to carefully think about what is our individual essence, what do I have to share? And there's nothing wrong with thinking about that I, which is currently very trendy to say, oh, ego, malo, malo, malo. Let's find the healthy in that. How do I find a relationship to my embodied self, the skin-encapsulated ego, that in Ananessa's terms isn't either or separate from the ecological self, that actually enables me to be. Like I'm more non-human cells than I'm human cells. I'm a walking ecosystem. I don't end at my skin. But how do I live the reality that it hurts me more if I get pinched than you get pinched? I can be compassionate with you getting pinched, but it hurts me more. And it's this weird paradox that I think we need to work both on self, community, and world at the same time on these three levels. And that is a long way of answering this very long question, because I find that the danger of memes like degrowth is it's an overswinging from, oh, growth was a problem, now we have degrowth. And yes, of course, that's oversimplifying, and we need to degrow, we need to decelerate, all of that. But I'm looking for a dialogue that is moving all of us onto a shared common ground with life. And that's aligned with a lot of the people that were in this long question with every right. And who am I to even say this? Like I can feel the potential rage flying at me, a white, overeducated male with a German passport, who's just the manifestation of the colonial privilege to some extent. Yeah? But I just would invite all of us to watch out when we other people and to name the trauma, to name the things we need to solve. But if it comes with the anger of these people, I don't think we have the time for that. We need to work on that energy. And so my very long answer is, yes, all of these things are possibly deeply informative to building regenerative cultures in place in the way that only the people in that place can. But not if it comes out of an energy that is othering others or is so hurt in the trauma that it first has to fight and give back rather than find the next step. I hope I didn't really offend the person who asked this question, and forgive me if I have.
Yeah, it's good.
How do you
I like this idea of the I, me, the community, and it's kind of amplifying our relationship. Like we often talk about an invitation for us to think about how we relate to ourselves, to other humans, and to the large living world. No, very, very important.
Just very briefly on that, I realized that, like, to some extent, one of the key thinking tools that you learn in the regenerative practitioner training with Regenesis is this: there's always an activating force and there's a restraining force. And normally we just have the two of them bumping against each other and nothing moves, and you get stuck in the system. And how do you push that into the higher ground that actually feeds both of them? How do you find the higher synthesis that turns this activation and restraining into the dynamic potential that lies between these polarities, rather than the either or of either we do this or we do that? And I can see that same thing reflected in the dynamic between, is it in the ego or is it in the eco? Like, is it in the I individual or the collective we? Well, the higher ground is service to life as a whole. Because if I serve life as a whole, I serve myself and I serve my community. And again, it's indigenous wisdom. Seva, that is a concept that comes out of the Vedanta and is a few thousand years old. And I'll stop sharing again. That's all. Yeah. Oh, the other question was, how do I live a regenerative life? I'm trying. It's not so easy. Like, if it's
about lifestyle, no?
Lifestyle, yeah.
How does a regenerative lifestyle look like?
Ideally, these are sort of, sometimes I feel like the danger is to, when you're asked question and put into the position of giving a masterclass, one ends up having opinions about things that one might not even know or is still inquiring into. So, like, again, a reminder that everything, even if I've said it strongly, is said from the spirit of living the questions together. From the spirit of, I might be wrong, I think this is important. I obviously, as you can see, care about this deeply, but I'm not the masterclass giving guy who tells you how to live a regenerative lifestyle. I don't want to take that responsibility on me. There's a book, I think, by Carol Sanford. I think it's called The Regenerative Life. So she's given me a lot of insights, even just reading her work, and that might help. But for me personally, it relates to what we were saying earlier, that it's something deeply human. Like, if I can nurture, and maybe that's also framing for, like, I'll come to your question when you remind me of it in a second before we go into the break. But I would suggest that maybe that's exactly the conversation we can have in the break. And indirectly, I've talked about it in different ways for the last 20 minutes, is if remembering the essence of indigenous teaching of interbeing with all life, which is half an answer to your values question, I think the story of interbeing, that word of Thich Nhat Hanh, would be a beautiful way of rewording how we relate, not just to each other as a human family, but to all of life. And more than relate, we are that larger transforming evolutionary journey. And therefore, our role is to participate appropriately in that. And now I've lost my thread from what I was saying earlier. I'm sorry about that. It's getting late here. It's 9:10. Living a regenerative life for me would be to ask the 3 questions that I see Indigenous people in different ways ask all over the world, over and over again, as one of their core invitations to participate appropriate in all my relations. And that's, does it serve myself? Does it serve my community? And does it serve life? If with everything you do, you find sensible answers to all 3 questions, and if one of them falters, you really think about doing it, or you do it differently, or you don't do it, then I think you might move towards living a regenerative life. And that's important for the activists among you, because if you, like I have done at points and seem to in a different way in the middle of doing it again, you put the urgency of what you do or the potential input that you could have at this so important point in the foreground, and you do not take care of yourself. You're not doing a favor to your community, and you're not doing a favor to life, no matter how urgent all these things are, because you can only do it for a short time before you burn out and you can't be of service to anybody anymore, your family or yourself or your community. And I think that's the wisdom we need to learn. But on the other hand, we've created a culture that only asked the first question only and said, me, and my family only, and my community went out of the window and the planet went out of the window. Of course, that's also impossible. But the danger is to overswing the pendulum and say, oh, we now all need to kind of sacrifice ourselves in the short term in order to heal the planet in the long term. And I think that's in danger of not living a regenerative life. And so I cannot answer it because I'm still on the journey of trying to
searching for the how.
Yeah, I mean, I've planted like a forest garden. I took on custodianship of 0.5 hectare. I put in 210 trees, and I'm working myself silly trying to keep them alive and keep the pump and the watering system up and do it ecologically, while I'm refitting a house that it was built nearly 50 years ago and is terribly built and is not sustainable, while I'm trying to be present for a 5-year-old girl that is my daughter and not be some idiot who's out there saving the planet, perpetuating the pattern of not being at home when they need to be at home. And so who am I to tell people how to live a regenerative life? It's a journey that we all need to find in ourselves and in our community. I think as part of this living the questions together, we need to find our support community, and it needs to be analog. Like, as beautiful as what we're doing here currently is, we need to be mindful of the fact that while we're sitting here for 2 hours, we're not sitting around a campfire 50 meters from our house. And I think we might need to do more of that in order to remember how to be regenerative.
Okay, and my question was around values and principles. What are the underlying values and principles of regenerative development, and how does that relate or have any synergies with the Earth Charter, or how the Earth Charter can be useful for that?
Let me just first, because I already picked up in the chat, for those who are on the call, of course, people watching this later might not see it unless you put it into the video. This is an article I wrote a while ago that is picking up this principle-based approach, because Carol Sanford has a very strong set of principles. Like, I read it briefly. Carol Sanford suggests 7 foundational principles of the regenerative approach. That it's about wholes, nested wholeness, where, like Arthur Koestler's holarchy. So it's a systemic view, nested complexity. It's about potential, which is working with this activating restraining force and how to reconcile them. It's about essence, the uniqueness in people and in places. It's about not a fixed outcome, but a continuous journey of learning. So it's developmental. It's nested, which is really important. It means that with everything you do at every scale, whether it's the personal, the family, the community, the bioregion, the nation, or the planet, you have to have at least 2 other scales adjacent to it in mind and how it serves those scales. Otherwise, it's not regenerative. So another deep sustainability issue. If you just do sustainable cities and you don't do bioregions, if you just do sustainable architecture and not sustainable community design, you'll never get there. So it's this nesting things in their context. Nodal interventions, it's very cryptic, but you wanted principles, nodes, meaning don't try to work with the whole system at once, try to find the points in the system that radiate out to the system and build interventions there. And fields, meaning in order to do this work, you can't do it alone. You need to create a local community and a field between co-conspirators to do this work and implement it in place. All of it very useful. I personally don't really like principle-based approach, but in this article that I shared, I think Bill Reed summarizes that approach in a language that is slightly less cryptic and more accessible. But for me, the value question is, those 3 issues. Does it serve life? Does it serve the community? And does it serve the individual? It's to understand that being, as Thich Nhat Hanh said, is interbeing. The universe is relational. And that also means, and this is important with regard to why are values and worldview important, it's in the beginning there was the word. We don't realize how critically important the way we think about things is about how the world shows up to us. Gregory Bateson's daughter, Nora Bateson, does wonderful work in provoking people into slowing down enough to see how deeply ingrained our thinking patterns make the world show up to us in a certain way. And it's that deeper conversation around how do we deprogram ourselves from 250 years of colonial trauma in so many places, and how do we deprogram ourselves when the boat's sinking on we need a solution quickly. Like, I mean, it's a normal knee-jerk response of anybody to say, anybody, even if it's Elon Musk, coming right over the hill and give me a technological solution. I think we would do well to ask that question about values to our indigenous elders. And since you've already done that work, this is the link to the Earth Charter. Let's start there. Let's say we developed the Earth Charter in the run-up to 2000 with Mikhail Gorbachev, who just recently died. We're seeing a deep division between these ridiculous blocks of the Cold War starting again. Can we, I can put you in touch with wonderful people in Russia. Can we find a few civil society players to meet in a place, put the Earth Charter on the table and say, let's have this conversation now, and talk to the people at the UN to say, let's have, I mean, ratifying agreements in the UN is symbolical, but it would be a wonderful conversation to have about the higher ground of worldview and value system, of letting go, both at the scale of the local community, in your business, in your own little project, at the bioregion, in your own regenerative life, and at the level of national and international policy, this belief that we all need to agree in order to act. Because we're too diverse, and our diversity is too clearly part of life's creative impulse that we would ever want to get to the point of all thinking the same or all agreeing on everything. But paradoxically, that doesn't mean we can do anything we want. We need to find the basic playing rules where it doesn't matter whether you're Muslim, Christian, Hindu, or anything, or atheist, or a scientism believer. We have to find the higher ground. And that higher ground is in our indigenous wisdom of saying we're all indigenous to life, we're all interbeing in this. We need to celebrate our diversity, but we can only celebrate our diversity if we live accordingly to basically Janine Benya's life creates conditions conducive to life. That's another way of summarizing how do you live regeneratively. Well, are you creating conditions conducive to life, your own life, your family life, your community life, the life of the planet? It's a difficult question to ask. We need to have a lot of eco-literacy in order to answer it well. And that's where education comes in. So, I mean, you're right at the heart of, with everything that we've been talking about, the work of Earth Charter International is right at the heart of it. But the sad thing is that institutions like yours or Schumacher College or Gaia Education or Finton should be given really significant attention to see how those patterns could inform people in other places to do something similar that is meaningful to them in their place. But we're still running in the outdated system. We're still thinking that MIT is the right way to go. Just to mention that, I've managed to work with a wonderful professor at ETH on a massive open online course, actually 4 massive open online courses that started earlier this year with the first one. They're called Designing Regenerative and Resilient Systems. They're kind of a very diverse introduction to the field, but it's a MOOC, so it's free to anybody. And it's, again, like what was interested is to actually find somebody within Europe's MIT, like one of the most recognized universities in Europe, to offer such a course. So yeah, things are changing.
Okay. Right. Thank you, Daniel. So now we are going to move into something else. Irma had her hand up, and I'm afraid I would like actually to invite you, Irma, if you want to come to the floor and ask your question, but just to share what we're going to do in the next half an hour or so. We are going to hear Irma's question or comment to you, and then we are going to split the groups, people in groups of 4 for a few minutes to share your insights or comments or questions you have had on this session, and any takeaways. And then we come back to the plenary again, and then we're going to open the floor for any questions participants have to you. Is that okay? Yeah, everybody?
I will not say much to the question. I'm sorry that we've sort of run over this part, but hey, it was an interesting conversation so far. So yeah,
that's good. Thank you. Irma, would you like to open your mic? And
yeah, well, it has, yeah. And also here it's 9:24 in the evening. Thank you so much, Daniel. You gave me lots to think about. And while I was thinking of a question, the conversation went on. So I was like, okay, what was the question again? But I recall when you said the word eco-literacy, because I sort of have a problem with the word eco-literacy, because literacy means something like you have to be able to read or do research or whatever, and that connects for me to what you were saying about connection to place and changing the worldview, and also with points in the system that radiates, finding the points in the system that radiates. And for me, storytelling there is very important, and maybe not even storytelling in what we write down, but I've been writing down a lot, but storytelling in the more traditional way, holding values, as you call values, or worldviews, if you say we need to change our worldviews, holding them into sharing those stories at the campfire, as you mentioned, is so essential that we sort of, but we forgot those kind of values, that kind of sharing in our Western world. So that was my train of thoughts.
Maybe just very briefly, yeah, personally, like I've done a lot of work with the Ojai Foundation in California and with a woman called Gigi Coyle, who wrote a book on called The Way of Counsel. One of the ancient ways of all over the world, you will find human beings have sat in circles around a fire. And very often you find that the fire represented the future unborn generations to them. And they did so under a sky where they could still see the vast cosmos and could ask questions of who are we, where are we going, where do we come from in this vastness. I believe that as we're moving more and more into these rapidly changing times of volatility and of othering and of old system breaking down because they're no longer fit for service in so many ways. That kind of work is at the center of how do we build, like Nora Bateson in a wonderful conversation that I had with her and Kate Rayworth and Joe Brewer, which is also online if you look at it in the podcast, Do More Optimism. Nora asked this question, how do we educate for the flexibility we don't know yet we need in the future? Whoa! That's a really big question. And I think that counsel is actually that way of doing it. And it also is the way of holding multiple worldviews at the same time. If you sit around the circle and you speak from the heart and you listen from the heart and you keep it to the essence and you're not paying attention because you trust that when you have the talking piece, you will say what needs to be said. And when you're listening 100%. That is a simple practice, but if people practice it, they have an embodied experience of knowledge coming out of the circle and not out of their own minds, of hearing themselves voice wisdom that comes out of eco-literacy. It's a clumsy term, I agree with you, but it's a bridge term. And I invite myself always to not be too judgmental of bridging terms because they're important. And my mentor and friend Fritjof Kapra's work with the Center of Eco-Literacy is definitely worth looking at, even if you don't like the term. But yeah, so the way of counsel, and just in a nutshell, this basically, we need something much more simple than technological solutions. We need to be able to sit down together and say, and now what? Because what's coming at us will be so surprising to all of us. That capacity to sit down in your community to say, and now what, is vital for our survival. And unfortunately, I think we've eroded that capacity drastically, particularly in the last 25 years. Let's go into, so the breakout groups is the question, just to repeat that. After all this wild roller coaster, how do you personally bring whatever resonated with you into your own life? Is there anything you need to change on the level of how do I take care of myself in order for you to be able to actually share your gifts more effectively with the community and all of life? How do we take care of those three levels? That's the conversation to have in the breakout groups.
Great. Thank you. So now we are going to go into breakout rooms. We'll be there for maybe 6 minutes, and then we'll come back to the plenary. And meanwhile, Daniel can take a rest, okay? We can give you a rest. Thank you. Okay, so thank you so much, and welcome back to our sort of plenary room.
6 minutes was way too short.
I know. Dirk, I give you the floor to come in, given that you already have your mic open. Would you like to share any insight you have had either from the first part of the breakout room?
There were some very wise things said by Sylvia and Naida. I was just mentioning that I was taking notes and I forgot the assignment, and then they remembered me, and I was taking notes on campfire sessions. And that came back into the comments. I was explaining that what I have to be careful for is that I'm quite enthusiastic, and sometimes I go too fast and I forget to make sure that my community goes with me, right? So I'm jumping ahead and I lose that connection. And then Ida said, go back to the storytelling, because that slows you down. And if you make sure that the storytelling becomes a dialogue and people can respond to it, and it becomes a two-way conversation. And every time you do that, you will notice different things in the story and nuances. And Sylvia had remarks that were on the same line. That for me that was the big party and big takeaway for this whole evening. Thanks to the inspirations by Daniel. I loved his story. Didn't agree with everything. I still have that radical hope that it's not too late. But yeah, the same sense of urgency and thinking in systems, but also making sure that we work from the perspective of ecosystems, right? We're all part of that system, the community we live in, the people we work with, and that we need to connect to these people. That's different than project management, where you have starting point and an end point and then milestones in between, and we have to stick within time and budgets and stuff like that. So, it's that the way of working is already circular. So yeah.
Thank you, Dirk. Good to hear from you. So the floor is open. So anyone who would like to ask a question or make a comment, just raise your hand and we'll give you the floor. If not, I'm gonna call by room, maybe. Yeah, Daniel.
Brief comment. I mentioned earlier that podcast conversation, because it's precisely like on a good day, I don't want to be that negative either. And I want to believe in that miracle of us making it through the eye of the needle. And this conversation with Kate Rayworth and Joe Brewer and Nora Bateson is precisely about that. How do we dance on that? Like, even if we've seen the iceberg, do we need to yell iceberg or just get on with something else? Is one thing that Kate Rayworth said there. Just people might enjoy it. And I also wanted to thank, what was her name? Somebody who's dropping in all the things. Jessica dropped in a lot of the links I mentioned. Be nice to put them in at the bottom of the video when you make that available.
Thank you, Daniel. Any other comment or question? So we have two hands raised up. Great. Let's see who wants to go first.
Jessica is the first on my screen, so let's go.
So Jessica. Jessica and then Claudia.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you, Daniel. Great respect for your work and really appreciate this time today. In our session, we talked a little bit about the tension of, the theorizing, the being, the conceptualizing versus the doing and the action and the application, and how this tension is difficult to hold, especially as we're trying to be mindful, but also go quickly, given the urgency. And so I've had kind of a burning question for you, and it's also, tied to my work. I'm a technology analyst, and so I've been studying for about 15 years the intentions and the designs that we are using technology to advance, and that's actually sort of my inroads into the regenerative concept. But there is a big tension there too, given the incredible pervasiveness of the mechanistic worldview, and especially in the tech space, our hyper quantification and competitiveness and solutioneering and fast paced, and it's everywhere you look. And so I'm curious how you think about the role of modern technologies as regenerative or in advancing regenerative designs. There's a lot there, but I would love to hear.
I saw that you put that in this question. I'm glad you're asking the question, because I think it's one of the dialogues we need to have to make that miracle possible that Dirk was referring to. I think that, and again, I've mentioned this a number of times today, paradoxes kind of show you that you're on to something. Like, on the one hand, yes, we will need technology to save us. And on the other hand, if we don't have a much more nuanced conversation about when to use technology, at what scale, and what technologies to use, and if we don't find a binding mechanism to not use every technology that we are humanly capable of, then it is very unlikely that we will survive. It's an existential threat to humanity to be unable to harness technology wisely. But that said, I wrote, you can find it, very academic paper in 2006, which was called Natural Born Cyborg, no, a Cyborg's Choice from, if you look at Cyborg's Choice, you'll find it. One of the things that I was scared about then was this prediction by Ray Kurzweil and Hans Moravec and people in the Singularity University, literally standing in front of students at MIT saying, you are the last carbon-based life forms. You will design the codes that will allow us to put human consciousness in a microchip in a robot, and you will live forever. That is so technologist sci-fi BS gone haywire that I can't even find words for it. But the fact is that the funding and the brain power is going there and not into regenerative technologies, unfortunately. And but at the same time, like we need to, the only way, Goethe said, if you can't see nature everywhere, you will see her nowhere in the right light 200 years ago. If we want to heal the human nature, culture, nature divide, then we have to do something that is really difficult for me to even say, which is we have to understand that all of nature, all of technology is within nature. Technology cannot be an other. It can be maladaptive technology. A nuclear weapon is probably a maladaptive technology that shouldn't have been invented in the first place. And yet it's that deeper conversation of how do we, on the one hand, understand that all the technologies we've created are part of this larger process of the planetary biosphere transforming within the context of a larger system, which is the cosmos. And how do we, and again, I personally, and that's where I'm maybe ideologically biased, I believe that in order to harness technologies wisely, we need to regionalize a lot of how we use technology. And we need to pay attention to what kind of technologies we use and whose control they are. Right now, more and more we're running blindly into a dystopian future where companies larger than nations control the key things we need to run our lives and therefore control us. And for anybody who hasn't seen it, there's a little spoof video that a unit at Cambridge University put out around a moratorium on target recognition autonomous weapon systems. If we don't have that conversation on the planet, we're done for. It's already technically possible to do the most atrocious things with a little drone and a bit of programming. So it's this weird, like the fact that I think you will particularly enjoy Olivia Lazard's talk at TED. Do yourself the favor of those 12 minutes. It's brilliant. Because it just shows how even the wonderful green technologies that we're so hoping that they will save us have a deeply systemically dangerous footprint, not just in terms of where they are, but also those power blocks who have the habit of thinking more long-term have cleverly positioned themselves to be in the processing capacity of all those rare earths and rare minerals. And that's China, not Europe and not the US. So we're like, even as we're going into that new green tech deal, let's be careful of how we run into it. And yet again, if we do it at a smaller scale, we can see the effects of our actions. So why not decentralize technology to the point that we can, in smaller ways, experiment with it and make it truly serve humanity? It's at the core of Goethe's Faust is the decision. Like it's as old as humanity. It's in the Torah, the Golem. Watch out what technologies you conjure. It's the wizard's apprentice. At some point it runs away with us. And so it's a hugely important question, and this was a roundabout way of not having a full answer for it.
Okay, Claudia?
Hola.
Hola, buenas tardes.
I just would like to just have some remarks on this remarkable and wonderful time spent having these deep conversations, which I think are so important. And the points I would like to address or say is that I think that regeneration is a deeply spiritual topic. And at the end of the day, it really also starts with our, let's say, where we are coming from our hearts, and to bring in the love consciousness, and that having that as a guidance of how we act, and actually, no, the mind, the heart, and the gut, at the end of the day, that all coming together is our guidance to make the right decisions, to just to add onto the technology conversation, which technology we are going to use, or which strategy in business, which strategy we are going to implement, but guided by that, because this is basically where it all comes down. And as long as we don't have love and reverence for our Mother Earth, then things will do not happen.
Exactly. Thank you for bringing that in. And yeah, it's the William Blake said at the beginning of the scientific revolution, may God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep. As a civilization, we're waking up from Newton's sleep. Newton's sleep is the one that only values one of the 4 ways of knowing that Jung spoke about. It only values thinking, the rational mind, the analyzable data, the scientifically provable stuff. And we're at a point where we need to dethrone scientism from its dogma, but not destroy science, because that would be detrimental. And right now, there's a lot of kind of not trusting science anymore, and that's also a problem. But the other 3 ways of knowing are sensing, feeling, and intuiting. All 3 of them are relational. They're about love. They're about spirituality, or how do I fit in a larger context of meaning appropriately. And they're also about qualities. They're about how we sense whether things feel right and fit in over time. And so if we don't bring those 4 ways of knowing back into balance in our culture through a new way of education, we're not there. And to start to come where you started, I'm glad you mentioned the word spirituality, because too often that word is almost, don't mention the S word, because somebody might not like it. In Catholic cultures, I live in Spain, many of you live in South America. One of my great mentors is a wonderful woman who was a systems scholar and a Buddhist scholar called Joanna Macy. And when I sent Joanna my book before I published it, so she would say something about it to put on the back cover, she said the most beautiful thing. She said, this is by far the most soul-stirring and intellectually stimulating book I have read in years. And by mentioning soul-stirring and intellectually stimulating, she speaks to exactly the bridge I was trying to make, to have enough systemic thinking, clear data, analysis of the issues at hand, and analysis of possible solution pathways, and so on, that scientifically minded people would say, okay, there's some meaning in this book. The guy isn't a complete crackpot. But to not shy away from over and over again, take people to the edge of the uncomfortable by speaking about interbeing, by speaking about that caring for the earth is to care for ourselves. But ultimately, yeah, love, as Maturana and Varela, one great Chilean who left us, but 2 of them. But Maturana said in The Biology of Love that all we have is the world we bring forth together. And the way of bringing it forth is through love. And so ultimately, even scientifically, at the conclusion of the Santiago theory of cognition is that it is the innate, what E.O. Wilson called biophilia, life's innate love for more life. that we need to connect with. Have you moved? I do this maybe too often lately, but it's such a powerful poem. I mentioned Joanna Macy. She translated Rilke's poems, which are collected in the Book of Hours, into English. And one of them is a poem that was written by now over 100 years ago. And to me, it speaks so deeply to the time we're at, and it speaks to what you, thank you so much, Chloe, for highlighting that, the importance of love. And it goes, "Dear darkening ground, you have endured so patiently the walls we've built. Maybe you'll give the churches the cities one more hour, cloisters and churches too. And those who labor, maybe you let their work grip them for another 5 hours or 7, until that moment of inexplicable terror, when you take back your name from all things and become water and widening wilderness again. Give me just a little more time. Give me just a little more time, so I may love the things until they're real and ripe and worthy of you. So I may love the things until they're real and ripe and worthy." Boom.
Good to stay with that and let that sink for some seconds. Thank you, Daniel. So anyone would like to ask one last question before we close? Either in insights you have had, or something you have learned, or a question you have for Daniel, just raise your hand and you can take the floor.
There's a question in the chat box.
Oh, gracias. Oh, how, and Catherine, how can we address and cure fear of change?
Mm-hmm. Let me just find you something one sec that I would love to share with everybody. Hold on, here. Where is it? There. Just because it's so related, we were dancing a lot about, do we still have a future? Is there still hope? This is a wonderful South American initiative, friends of mine who I met here on Mallorca, but have since moved back to Argentina. It's called El Futuro Imposible. And it's a beautiful series of micro-documentaries. Just this darkening ground, they got Vandana Shiva to read that poem and then put a little video along with it. It's really recommended. But it's also to speak to exactly that. Like, we have solutions. This video is done collaboratively by people all over the planet, highlighting people in whatever the economy of well-being and transition towns, donor economy. We have so many solutions, pathways, warm data. We need to bring these conversations into our local community and say, can we stop being stunned by the lack of agency we have to face and change the global problems that are out there, and start by manifesting the local potential we have in this place to work the double strategy of preparing for an uncertain future, building bioregional resilience in the face of climate change and coming transformations, but at the very same time, make it through a pathway of healing the local soils, the local rivers, the local forests, the local capacity in the community to talk to itself and to make decisions together. All of that are salutogenic healing pathways, regenerative in their very nature. And if we focus on them in our region, but in a mindset that isn't creating a lifeboat just for us in our region, but in a mindset that says, wherever we can, let's share what we're learning with people elsewhere, and let's learn from them and enable other people to do the same elsewhere, then I think we still do have a chance to continue that journey of maturation in the human being that is necessary that we actually have a long-term future.
With these words, I think we can close and express our gratitude and appreciation to you, Daniel, and to everybody who participated in today's session, in thinking about our journey of maturation, did we say? It's an important point for us to think. So thank you so much, Daniel. I'd like to invite you to continue connected with us. I really want to always think about ways in which we can work together and collaborate. Thank you and thank everybody for taking part in it. We still have 2 more masterclasses this year. The next one is on consciousness with Cassandra or Cassie Vietnam from California, and one in November with Rolf Winters on the wisdom of native people. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a good evening or afternoon, depending on where you are.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Gracias. Obrigado.